Epiphany is a season where we usually hear stories about the baptism of Christ and the story of the wise men, two accounts that reveal God to us in the Christ. But what do we do with those kinds of stories of the divine being unveiled to us? How do we respond? Perhaps a look at the wise men can maybe point us in the direction of what it looks like to respond well to the manifestation of Christ. The wise men ask this question: where's the one who's been born the King of the Jews? It was a dangerous question then, and perhaps one now. It's a question that came in the face of the unsuspecting crowds, the oblivious yet religious ones, and the fearfully violent powerhouse Herod, who is immediately threatened by the unexpected announcement of a king that could usurp the throne. It is here, with a single question hanging in the air, that the wise men, despite all that should have caused them to turn back for fear of their lives, for doubt of their story, for the possibility that they could be wrong, choose instead to move in the direction of where Jesus is. The wise men, despite all of the reasons to stand still, to turn back, to dismiss this nudge, and call to go forward, choose to follow. And so to follow is perhaps one of the greatest responses we can offer when the Christ is revealed, when the Christ is made manifest, when we come to learn that the King of Kings, the Messiah, the one that we call Jesus, is on the move. This invitation, however, is not a new one. To move in the direction of where God is, to move in the direction of where God is moving, is really this long whisper that we call the Old Testament. Time after time, we read the encounters of people who are simply asked to move in the direction of where God is moving. They're asked to follow. That is where we find ourselves in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 3. The passage begins with this kind of ominous note that God was hard to hear. God was hard to find in those days, and some may even suggest that God was silent. Now, we can think of that as God giving creation the cold shoulder, turning his back on them. Or we can see it as a people who perhaps have stopped listening, who have perhaps stopped moving in the direction of where God is moving, a people who are no longer compelled to follow. And it's in this context, when others are unable to hear, when others insist God is silent, God is unmoving, that God no longer speaks, that the voice of God wakes up Samuel and invites him to listen and invites him to follow. But Samuel, despite living in the same house as a priest, has never considered that God could speak to him, that God knew him, that God knows of him, that God knows him. And so he assumes that the voice calling him comes from Eli, the priest. And even the priest in this moment can't imagine that God might invite Samuel to follow, and at first simply tells him to go back to sleep. That is, until he remembers that while it may seem that God is quiet these days, it doesn't mean that God has stopped speaking. Just because he, Eli, may have forgotten what it is to follow, forgotten what it is to listen, forgotten what it is to hear, it doesn't mean that God isn't still in the business of inviting those who have ears to hear to move in the same direction that the one who is I am is moving. And so Eli has this privileged moment to let Samuel know that it is in recognizing that God knows your name and that God longs to be known by you that there is really only one response, whether loud or quiet, and that is, here I am. I will follow. I will move where God is moving. I will walk in the direction of where God is leading. I will move in the direction of where God is. And in Samuel's story, to follow God is to speak a hard truth to Eli, to speak a hard word to the one who is supposed to be leading the people to be followers, but instead has somehow given up on listening, given up on following, and instead has simply begun responding and perhaps even ignoring. And so the word that Samuel is given on one hand is difficult to hear and difficult to accept, but on another, it's an invitation for this wayward priest who had thought God was silent, who had stopped expecting that God would lead, to somehow begin to put one foot in front of the other. And so even he, Eli, is invited to follow. And both Samuel and Eli and soon all of Israel will recognize that they are seen by God, that they are known by God, and that they are invited to know God. They are invited to follow, to move in the direction of where God is moving. But sometimes, where God is moving is not where we want to move. It's unfamiliar. It's uncertain. It's scary. Yet the God who knows us, the God who walks with us, the God who knows more about us than we know of ourselves, still invites us to take steps into spaces where we have not been before, to participate in the renewal of all things, to follow the words and teachings of Jesus, to offer love in radical ways, to be a people of peace, to be a people who sound and act and love like how God first loved us. Some time ago, I was sitting in this room of people praying, and they had gathered to pray for revival, which you come to discover sometimes in those settings is actually coded language for God to allow everything to remain unchanged and to ask others to conform to our unchangedness. Yet they were sincere. And as their prayer kind of came out, it could be summarized like this and extolled with great passion. Dear Lord, help me to never have to change, to never rethink my ideas, to never question my perspectives or rethink my understanding of you, and lead all those who do so to repentance. Their prayer was in direct response to theological and doctrinal questions that were being kind of pondered by the group. And I found myself shaken because it sounded to me that they were praying fervently that God would not ask them to follow. That they would never have to move in the direction of God unless it allowed them to stand exactly where they were, to move in the direction that they wanted to go in, and to remain completely unchanged. Yet despite this discrepancy, the entire room swelled with amens, and my eyes kind of filled with tears, as they do in those situations. And it led them, and as fear kind of led them, and we could see that it kind of could block where God would want to take them. And I wonder if at their very core, if they too wondered, like Samuel, if God could speak despite all that was silent. I wonder if they wondered like the wise men, if they came face to face with all that insisted that to move in the direction of where Jesus is held such great risks and threats that it was more compelling to stand still. But somehow it isn't coming face to face with these questions and with risk attached with the radical act of following Jesus. The pull to say, I would rather stand still than move forward. Somehow it is right there that we are reminded that we are far more prepared and far more equipped to move in the direction of where Jesus is. That we are far more equipped to move in the direction of where Jesus is moving simply by recognizing that we are known, we are seen, and we are loved by God. You see, the invitation to move in the direction of justice, to move in the direction of love, to move in the direction of compassion and mercy, grace, forgiveness, and belonging, to move in the direction of Jesus, that is what we were created for. It's what we were designed for. It's what we were built for, exactly as we are with all of our personality and experiences, defaults, missteps, and perfections. The God who knows us, the God who sees us, whose very breath sustains us, also beckons us to follow. Psalm 139 has carried me through some challenging moments, as it is this reminder that regardless of where I find myself, regardless of the reasons I don't want to follow, all of the reasons that fear is easier to walk behind than Christ, Psalm 139 reminds me that I am known by God, that God sees me, that God is present. And somehow that offers me enough courage to walk in the direction of where Jesus is, the direction where Jesus is moving. Because the God who sees me, who knows me, who has known me, and who is revealed to me, has prepared me to follow in very specific ways, to accomplish very specific things, to participate in my corner of the world. I am invited to follow despite all that I think disqualifies me, all of the powers that want to stop me, all of the religiosity that wants to overcomplicate it, all of that which should make me want to stand still. And so I follow. I move in the direction of where Jesus is, in the direction of where Jesus is moving, but more often than not, I do it in a very similar fashion to how my kids followed me on that October 31st. With these reminders to slow down, with nudges to take a step, with a pace ahead of me that sometimes feels too fast and at times feels too slow, with shouts of caution and whispers of encouragement, with some laughter and some tears, and a little bit of stumbling and the constant reminder that this is what I was made for. And so I follow with echoes of Psalm 139 surrounding me. You see me. You know everything I do. You go before me. You place your hand of blessing on me. I can never escape your spirit. When I wake up, you are still with me. And so my prayer is this. Lord, give us courage to move in the direction of where Jesus is, even when it's hard, even when it's costly, even when it asks us to leave behind those things we've held on to so dearly. Help us to move in the direction of where Jesus is, to follow as I am to where you are. Let's turn our attention to the screen.